The night was quiet, too quiet for a city like this. Aisha sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the digital clock on the nightstand. 2:47 a.m. Her husband, Raza, was still not home. She picked up her phone, hesitating for a moment before dialing his number. It went straight to voicemail. Again. A cold shiver ran down her spine. This wasn't the first time. For months, she had ignored the uneasy feeling creeping inside her, brushing it off as paranoia. After all, Raza was the perfect husband, charming, successful, and deeply in love with her. That's what everyone said. That's what she had believed. But then came the whispers. The strange phone calls at odd hours. The sudden disappearances with no explanations. And the look in his eyes, sometimes distant, sometimes too intense, like he was hiding something. Aisha sighed, rubbing her temples. Maybe she was overthinking. Maybe he really was just busy with work. She stood up to get some water when the front door creaked open. Her breath hitched. She stepped out of the bedroom, peering down the dimly lit hallway. Raza stood at the entrance, his broad shoulders stiff, his hands shoved into his pockets. His face was turned away, but Aisha could see the tension in his posture. "You're late," she said softly, trying to keep her voice steady. He turned to her slowly, a small smile curling his lips. "Work ran late. You should be sleeping." She stepped closer, noticing something dark on his collar. Her heart pounded. "What's that?" Raza followed her gaze and casually brushed his fingers over the stain. "Just some ink. A mess at the office." Ink. But Aisha knew better. The color was too dark, too thick, and the metallic scent in the air made her stomach twist. Her husband walked past her, pressing a kiss to her forehead. His lips were warm, but his skin was ice-cold. "Go to sleep, love," he whispered. Aisha stood frozen as he disappeared into the bathroom. The sound of running water filled the silence. She swallowed hard. Something was very, very wrong. The next morning, Aisha woke up to the smell of freshly brewed coffee. Raza was already in the kitchen, dressed neatly in his usual crisp white shirt, acting as if nothing had happened last night. "Morning, love," he greeted her with a smile, handing her a cup. His eyes were warm, gentle, the same eyes she had fallen in love with. But Aisha couldn't forget the dark stain on his collar. The way his hands had trembled slightly when he brushed it off. She forced a smile and took a sip of coffee. "You came home late," she said casually, watching his reaction. Raza didn't flinch. "Told you, work ran late. I had some reports to finish." Aisha nodded, pretending to believe him. But she knew. She had checked. His office had been closed by 10 p.m. As he scrolled through his phone, she discreetly glanced at his hands. His nails were clean now, but she could swear there had been something under them last night, something dark. Her fingers tightened around the cup. She had to know. Later that day, while Raza was in the shower, Aisha slipped into the laundry room. His white shirt was already soaking in detergent. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, inspecting the collar. The stain was still faintly visible. She grabbed her phone and snapped a picture. Then, acting quickly, she placed the shirt back and exited the room before he could notice. That night, after Raza fell asleep, she lay beside him in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her mind raced. Who was he, really? The man she loved? Or someone she never truly knew? And then her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Stay away from him." Her blood ran cold. Aisha's fingers trembled as she stared at the message. A chill ran down her spine. She quickly sat up in bed, glancing at Raza. He was still fast asleep, his breathing steady, his face peaceful, too peaceful. Who sent this message? And how did they know? Heart pounding, she tapped on the number. No name. No profile picture. Just a blank screen. She hesitated, then typed, "Who are you? What do you mean?" Seconds felt like hours as she waited for a reply. But nothing came. She turned off her phone and lay back down, her mind racing. Maybe it was a prank. Or maybe someone was trying to warn her. But warn her about what? The next morning, Aisha decided she couldn't sit in the dark anymore. She needed answers. After Raza left for work, she took his shirt to a small medical lab across town. She had seen crime shows before. If the stain was what she feared, she needed proof. "How soon can I get the results?" she asked the technician. The man adjusted his glasses and looked at the stain carefully. "Depends on the test, but a basic one will take a few hours. Come back in the evening." Aisha nodded and left, her heart heavy. She spent the day trying to keep herself busy, but every little thing reminded her of Raza, the way he smiled, the way he touched her face so gently. Could he really be hiding something? By evening, she was back at the lab. The technician handed her an envelope. His expression was unreadable. "You should be careful," he said quietly. Aisha's breath caught in her throat. She stepped outside, found a quiet corner, and ripped open the envelope. Her hands went ice cold as she read the results. The stain was blood. Human blood. Her head spun. Her worst fears were coming true. She clutched the paper tightly, trying to breathe. And then her phone buzzed again. A new message. From the same unknown number. "I warned you. Now it's too late." Aisha's breath caught in her throat. Her fingers tightened around her phone as her eyes darted around the street. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the pavement. Was someone watching her? Her heart pounded as she typed a reply. "Who are you? What do you know about Raza?" No response. She swallowed hard and forced herself to move. She needed to get home before Raza. She needed to think. By the time she reached her apartment, the sky was completely dark. The air inside felt heavy, like something was pressing down on her chest. She locked the door and leaned against it, closing her eyes for a moment. Then she heard it. A faint drip, drip, drip coming from the bathroom. Her stomach twisted. She hadn't used the sink. Slowly, she stepped forward. The door was slightly open, just enough to see the edge of the mirror. The light flickered. Her hands shook as she pushed the door wider. And then she saw it. The sink was smeared with red. Dark streaks ran down the porcelain, dripping into the drain. Aisha's breath hitched as she staggered back. Her mind screamed at her to run, to leave, but she couldn't move. Then a voice, soft, calm, chilling, echoed behind her. "You shouldn't have done that, love." Aisha whipped around, her body frozen in fear. Raza stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. His sleeves were rolled up, and for the first time, she noticed the faint splatters of red on his forearm. "I was going to tell you," he said, stepping closer. "But now you forced my hand." Aisha's pulse roared in her ears. The apartment suddenly felt too small, the walls closing in. What did you do, Raza?" she whispered. His lips curved into a slow, eerie smile. "I protected us." A sharp knock on the door made both of them freeze. Aisha's heart leapt. From the other side, a deep voice spoke. "Madam, open the door. This is the police." For a moment, silence filled the room. The only sound was Aisha's ragged breathing and the rhythmic pounding of her heart against her ribs. The police. They were here. Her eyes flickered to Raza. His expression didn't change, no panic, no fear. Instead, he exhaled slowly, almost as if he had been expecting this. "Aisha." His voice was eerily calm. "You're going to open that door, and you're going to tell them everything is fine." She took a step back, shaking her head. No, I'm not." Raza's jaw tightened. His fingers twitched at his sides. Another knock, louder this time. "Madam, we need you to open the door. We have questions about your husband." Aisha's pulse spiked. This was her chance. She could end this nightmare right now. But then Raza did something that sent pure ice through her veins. He smiled. Not his usual warm smile, the one she had fallen in love with. This was different, cold, knowing. A smile that told her he still had control. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he murmured. "Not unless you want them to find something unpleasant." Aisha's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You think you know everything now, don't you? The late nights, the stains, the messages." He let out a small chuckle. "But you have no idea how deep this goes." Aisha's skin prickled with terror. "Raza," she whispered, barely able to get the words out. His eyes darkened. "If you let them in, they won't just take me." He tilted his head. "They'll take you too." Her breath hitched. "What are you talking about?" He leaned in, so close she could feel his breath on her cheek. "Check your phone, love." Hands shaking, she raised her phone and unlocked the screen. A new message had arrived. Not from the unknown number. From Raza. She clicked on it and the image loaded. Aisha felt the world tilt beneath her feet. It was a picture of her from last night, as she stood over the sink holding his blood-stained shirt, and in the reflection of the mirror behind her. A body, wrapped in plastic, in their apartment. Her own voice barely sounded like her own as she choked out, "No. No, I didn't." Raza tilted his head. "You sure?" A loud bang on the door made her flinch. "Last warning, madam. Open the door now." Aisha's legs felt weak. If she let them in, would they believe her? Or had Raza just turned her into his perfect alibi? Aisha's breath came in shallow gasps. Her mind raced, replaying the image over and over. The body, in their apartment, the blood on her hands. But it wasn't real. Couldn't be real. Could it? The banging on the door grew louder. The police weren't going to wait much longer. She turned to Raza, desperation clawing at her throat. What did you do? His expression remained unreadable, but there was something in his eyes. Something twisted, something terrifying. I told you, he said softly. I protected us. Her fingers curled into fists. Protected us from what? A slow smirk played on his lips. From the truth. The doorknob rattled. The officers were about to force their way in. Aisha's mind screamed at her to run, to do something, but her body wouldn't move. Then, suddenly, Raza stepped back, lifting his hands in surrender. Go ahead, Aisha, he said, voice smooth. Let them in. Tell them what you know. Her throat tightened. He wanted her to open the door, because he knew, no matter what she said, no matter how much she begged, she was already trapped. Her fingerprints were on the blood-stained shirt. She had taken the picture of the evidence herself. And that body. What if it really was there? Aisha's hands trembled as she reached for the doorknob. She had no choice. With a deep breath, she turned it and pulled the door open. Two officers stood on the other side, their expressions stern. Aisha Raza, one of them asked. She swallowed hard. Why yes? The officer glanced behind her. Ma'am, we need to come inside. Her pulse pounded in her ears. This was it. She stepped aside. Okay. The officers walked in, their eyes scanning the apartment. One of them turned to Raza. Sir, we have some questions for you regarding. A loud gasp cut through the air. Aisha spun around and her blood ran cold. One of the officers had opened the bathroom door. His face twisted in horror. His hand flew to his gun. Because inside the bathroom, lying motionless on the floor, wrapped in plastic, was the body, exactly where the picture had shown. And then, before Aisha could react, Raza did something that made her world shatter. He stepped forward, turned to her, and with a chilling softness, whispered, See, love? You did know. Then, with a single step, he raised his hands and smiled as the officers arrested him. Aisha stood frozen, her mind drowning in chaos. The officers pinned Raza against the wall, cuffing his wrists. But he didn't resist. He didn't fight. He just stood there, smiling. A shiver ran down her spine. This wasn't panic. This wasn't regret. This was planned. Ma'am, one of the officers called out, snapping her back to reality. His eyes were sharp, watching her closely. Do you know anything about this? Aisha's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her head shook instinctively. I don't know, she stammered. I swear, I didn't know. The officer exchanged glances with his partner. Then, in a steady voice, he said, Ma'am, I need you to come with us. Her stomach dropped. What? No, I had nothing to do with this. Behind her, Raza chuckled softly. Oh, love, he murmured. That's not what the evidence will say. Aisha whipped around, her heart pounding. What are you talking about? The smirk on his lips deepened. You touched my shirt, didn't you? His voice was low, almost teasing. You hid it, cleaned it. You even took a picture. And that body. His eyes gleamed. Well, who do you think led the police straight to it? Aisha's breath hitched. No, this wasn't happening. She turned to the officers, desperation clawing at her throat. He's lying. He's setting me up. The officer frowned, studying her. Then explain this, he said, holding up his phone. Aisha's blood went cold. On the screen was a security footage, still grainy but unmistakable. It was her, dragging something heavy into the bathroom. Her hands, her face, the plastic-wrapped body at her feet. Aisha staggered back. No, this isn't real. This didn't happen. But the proof was right there. The officer's expression hardened. Ma'am, you need to come with us for questioning. Aisha turned back to Raza, her vision blurring with panic. You did this, she whispered. You set me up. Raza simply smiled. Did I? He tilted his head. Or did you? Tears burned in her eyes. I don't remember this. The officers grabbed her wrists. Cold metal wrapped around them as the handcuffs clicked into place. No. Please, listen to me. I didn't do this, she screamed. But they weren't listening. As they dragged her toward the door, Raza called after her, his voice dripping with amusement. See you soon, love. And then, as if this was all just a game to him, he winked. Aisha sat in the cold, dimly lit interrogation room, her wrists raw from the handcuffs. The weight of everything pressed against her chest like a boulder. She had lost track of time, minutes, hours? She didn't know anymore. The door creaked open and a detective walked in. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with tired eyes that had seen too much. He dropped a file on the table and sat across from her, arms folded. Mrs. Raza, he began, his voice calm but firm. Do you want to tell us what really happened? Aisha swallowed hard. I don't know. I swear, I don't remember any of it. The detective didn't blink. He slid the file toward her and flipped it open. Inside were photos, horrifying, undeniable. The plastic-wrapped body. The blood-streaked sink. The security footage of her. Aisha's breath came in short gasps. It was like watching a nightmare unfold before her eyes. But I didn't do this, she whispered. The detective leaned forward. Then how do you explain the evidence? Aisha shook her head violently. I don't know. I woke up to a message warning me about Raza. I found his bloody shirt, I took it to get tested, and then she exhaled shakily. Then I saw that picture on my phone, the one with the body. But I didn't take it. I don't remember taking it. The detective studied her, his expression unreadable. Who sent you the message? Aisha hesitated. It was from an unknown number. He sighed and leaned back, rubbing his temples. Convenient. A lump formed in her throat. I'm not lying. The detective closed the file. Mrs. Raza, your husband has already confessed. The room spun. Aisha gripped the edge of the table. What? He admitted to the murder, the detective said. Said he did it to protect you. Aisha felt her body go numb. No, he's playing a game. He's setting me up. The detective didn't react. He says you were the one who killed the victim. He only helped you cover it up. Aisha's stomach lurched. That's a lie. But then the detective leaned in, lowering his voice. Is it? She looked into his eyes and something shifted. There was doubt there. Suspicion. Like he wasn't sure if she was innocent. Her breath caught in her throat. Was this Raza's plan all along? Not just to frame her, but to make her doubt herself? The detective tapped a finger against the table. Mrs. Raza, I'm going to ask you one last time. A long pause. Do you really not remember? Aisha opened her mouth to protest, but then something flickered in her mind. A flash of red. The smell of metal. The weight of something heavy in her hands. Her pulse spiked. No, it wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But the memory was there now. Buried deep. Waiting to be uncovered. Aisha's breath quickened. The images flashing in her mind didn't make sense, but they felt real. The smell of blood. The sensation of something slick on her hands. The sound of plastic rustling. Her head throbbed as she squeezed her eyes shut, trying to push the thoughts away. No, this isn't my memory. It's a trick. Raza is manipulating me. But then another memory surfaced. A dark room. A shadowed figure standing over someone. A sharp object glinting in dim light. And then her own voice. This has to be done. Aisha's eyes snapped open, her body trembling. No, I didn't say that. I don't remember saying that. The detective was watching her closely. You're remembering something, aren't you? Aisha's lips parted, but no words came out. Her heart pounded so violently she thought she might be sick. The door creaked open. Another officer leaned in, whispering something to the detective. His expression shifted slightly, something between surprise and confusion. Then he turned back to Aisha. Your husband just changed his story. Aisha's pulse skipped. What? The detective folded his arms, studying her. He's now saying you had nothing to do with it. That he acted alone. Aisha's mouth went dry. Why would he then? A terrifying realization struck her. Raza wasn't just framing her. He was playing with her mind. He wanted her to doubt herself. To wonder if she had actually done it. And now, by suddenly changing his confession, he was planting a final, deeper seed of chaos inside her. The detective leaned in. I'll ask you again, Mrs. Raza. His voice was sharp, cutting through the fog in her brain. Did you kill that man? Aisha stared at him. Her own thoughts were a war zone now. Did she? Did she help? Or was she just another pawn in Raza's twisted game? A single tear slid down her cheek. She didn't know anymore. Aisha sat in silence, her entire world unraveling thread by thread. She wanted to scream, to claw her way out of this nightmare, but the walls were closing in, suffocating her. The detective's gaze bore into her. If your husband is lying, now is your chance to prove it. Her lips trembled. How? He leaned forward. Tell us something only you would know. Something that proves he's manipulating you. Aisha's mind raced. The memories, real or false, blurred together in a storm of confusion. But then something clicked. The message. The unknown number. Her hands clenched into fists. Someone had warned her. Someone knew what was happening before she did. "I need my phone," she blurted out. The detective frowned but signaled an officer. Moments later, her phone was placed in front of her. Her fingers trembled as she unlocked it, scrolling frantically through her messages. Then she found it. The unknown message. "He isn't who you think he is. Get out before it's too late." Her heart pounded. "Look," she said, shoving the phone toward the detective. He examined the screen, then his eyes darkened. "This number, it's been disconnected." Aisha's stomach dropped. "What?" "This number doesn't exist anymore," the detective explained. "Either someone wiped it or it was never real to begin with." Aisha felt a cold chill run down her spine. Had Raza planted the message himself? Was this part of his game? Or a new thought surfaced, one more terrifying than the rest. What if someone else was involved? Suddenly, the door burst open. Another officer rushed in, his face pale. "Sir, we just searched the rest of their apartment." The detective turned. "And?" The officer hesitated. "We found another body." Aisha's breath caught in her throat. Another? She felt like she was drowning, unable to speak, unable to breathe. Then, the officer added something that made her blood run ice cold. "It's been there for weeks." The room tilted. Aisha barely registered the detective's voice. The officers moving, the papers shifting. Weeks? She had been living there, sleeping in that apartment. With him. Her head snapped up, her voice barely a whisper. "Who is it?" The officer swallowed hard. Then he looked her straight in the eyes. "We don't know yet. But we found something next to the body." He stepped forward and placed a small plastic evidence bag on the table. Inside was a single, delicate item. A gold bracelet. Aisha's bracelet. Her own bracelet. The one she thought she had lost weeks ago.